Engagement with Parliament of Zimbabwe for the purposes of getting Section 79 repealed was a long process that started with persistent lobbying, sensitization workshops for lawmakers helped them to understand the issue from a human rights and public health perspective. From there on, we were looking at the most expedient way to get the law reformed. We were looking at the repeal of Section 79 of the Criminal Law and Codification Reform Act. This act is the act that contains all criminal laws here in Zimbabwe. And essentially, this law provided for an offense that was termed along the lines of willful or deliberate transmission of HIV.
But in actual fact, it was actually deliberate exposure of HIV. The provision criminalized anyone who, knowing that they were HIV positive or realizing the possibility that they might be HIV positive, and that person does anything that would infect another person or could infect another person.
And the sentence was above 10 years that one could get if they were convicted.
So the provisions themselves were very broad. They were broad enough to capture a lot of different situations. There were cases where sexual partners, whether they were married or in relationships, would report another one after they tested HIV positive, or even a woman that was arrested for breastfeeding. And the majority of the people that got caught up were women. And one of the reasons is that, particularly with regard to antenatal care, a pregnant woman goes and has an antenatal check and they get tested for HIV. They disclose their status to their partner, and then their partner decides to have them arrested.
Having criminalized this health concern, it had such challenges. Firstly, in terms of criminal law, the threshold for proving any crime is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, to establish such a proof beyond a reasonable doubt, you would need to have thoroughly canvassed many things and brought before the court a lot of evidence that could not be brought.
Some of the statements that were out there were that it's difficult to prove this case because there wasn't any scientific way of proving who infected who, for example. Then public health arguments also included that because this offense was based on knowledge or perceived knowledge of HIV status, the unintended consequence is that people would not want to get tested because once you get tested, you are potentially somebody who could be arrested.
It was actually suppressing health-seeking behaviors. What this offense was doing was undermining the national health strategy response, where we were looking at achieving the 95-95 goals, prevention of mother to child, and then having someone know their status, get on treatment if you require treatment, so that you can suppress your viral load and not be further transmitting the virus. So those were a lot of the factors that were at play and pushing for us to reform this law, which was actually not helping us in any way in our response and fight against HIV transmission.
Criminalizing HIV is not helping in any way to stop HIV transmission. Currently, in most of the African countries, we continue to see an increase in HIV, especially among the adolescent girls and young people. So the fear that people living with HIV experience when they are in a country that criminalize HIV, and Uganda is one of those countries that criminalize it, and one of the fears that we live with is disclosure. We are scared to disclose because we know that laws are targeting those who have disclosed or those who know their HIV status. Stigma becomes a key component when there is criminalization, and all that undermines the issues around access to health and public health gains.
So the Mobilization was very broad. It involved the community, people living with HIV. It included other civic society actors. It included lawyers, as well as legislators that were actually lobbied to look at the provisions. It also included the media.
We had health experts, medical professionals in the public health sector who provided evidence-based arguments to support and inform the discussion papers that were crafted. We had civil society actors, key ones including the Zimbabwe National Network of People Living with HIV, ZNP+. We had the primary institution that is tasked with the coordination of the fight against HIV in Zimbabwe, the National AIDS Council. We also had organizations such as the HR and my organization, where I work, Health Law and Policy Consortium. We also had international partners such as the UNAIDS, the Global Network of People Living with HIV, GNP+. So really it was a lot of hands on deck.
The other countries need to learn from Zimbabwe about coalition building and what it takes to build a coalition. It means you have to find out your allies, you have to find your position, you have to align your agenda, and you have to mobilize resources. Resources, both human resources and financial resources. Then you're able to strongly advocate for decriminalization.
As we were doing our awareness raising campaigns, we were fortunate to have experts, public health experts who also occupy public offices like Dr. Ruth Laborde coming on board to speak and to give testimonies. Now, Dr. Laborde is a medical health practitioner who happens also to be a member of parliament. So she could speak from the perspective of a public health expert as well as from the perspective of being a lawmaker who was then influential in mobilizing and sensitizing amongst her peers. And she actually was a key player because she was able to narrate the history behind why the law had been created and why the law was no longer effective.
Welcome, Dr. Laborde. So I want to go back 20 years ago to when you actually were promoting HIV criminalization. What were you thinking about when you decided to push for an HIV criminalization law?
Around 2000, the year 2000, I was working, or even earlier than that, in an infectious disease hospital. And boom, there was this disease called HIV, and we had no treatment. And we didn't know what to do. Specific cases that really got on my nerves were of husbands who had been working in South Africa, fell sick there, came to Zimbabwe, we tested them for HIV, and I spoke to them, I asked them to say, we have tested your wife also, she's negative. Should we cancel both of you together and tell you how you can still be husband and wife and not infect the other person? One specifically young guy said, if I dare, he will kill me. But the wife was suspicious because she kept on following me in the ward. She would say, doctor, what is wrong with my husband? I'll say, your husband has to talk to me. It happened to 2-3 people. At that time, there was now a movement led by the Women's Coalition saying, enough is enough. Everybody who infects the other person must be incarcerated. And I agreed. And I joined the movement, lobbied for it. Lobbied for it as a doctor, gave evidence to empower those people who were in front. I said, let's lock everybody up. Who has infected somebody? And hopefully we can reduce the HIV. And I was very convinced that at that moment, it was the only solution available.
So at what point did you start to understand that this law was doing more harm than good, especially to the women that you wanted to protect?
Yeah, and then time went by, I left my job. Then I got into politics. Then I got to parliament. I was taken to a meeting. I was told I was going to present on criminalization and decriminalization. So I thought about it. Then I started reading a few articles. And I said, okay. I realized then that yes, we had achieved in putting in a law, but definitely the law, according to the data coming out and the investigations, research results, we are not achieving what we wanted to achieve. The infection rate is still there. And also we do not have the technology to identify who infected who. For all we know, we are throwing into prison the wrong people. And women have become a victim of the law because they fall in love. Then the woman gets pregnant, she goes for the antenatal clinic, she's told she's positive. A woman would go back to the husband and say, the doctor said we can live with this, but the men will run to the police. And in Zimbabwe, the person who got to the police first was the innocent one. So when we were in that workshop and I listened to other countries, I was so ashamed of myself. I really made up my mind. I said, when we get to Zimbabwe, let's have a workshop.
It's a very emotive issue, particularly with the public. And legislators are convinced or affected by public opinion. So it was also important to have the public educated about HIV and the effects of criminalization so that the members of parliament would not feel that they are going against, their constituencies.
What National AIDS Council did is that they would hold trainings, sensitization trainings, to train media practitioners and media editors, media house editors, because they're the fourth estate and they had ready platforms through which there could be verifiable information that would then be disseminated. We sensitized the media practitioners, members of parliament, and the Parliamentary Legal Committee to advocate for the repeal of Section 79.
The community mobilized itself because part of the process for lawmaking in Zimbabwe is public consultations. And so they actually took charge or took advantage of that opportunity to engage with the legislators. And it was important because the legislators were able to see that the communities that are most affected are the ones that are actually advocating for the repeal of this law.
I had already set up in Parliament a group of champions called Sexual Reproductive Health Champions. All civil society organizations working in SRH. We started having meetings almost every month. My job was to face the Minister of Justice. I come from the opposition. As a member of parliament, you must always depoliticize health. And how do you do that? Get into a relationship with a minister. Because in Zimbabwe, parliament cannot bring a case or change a law without the relevant minister literally bringing it to parliament. We can lobby, and we are lobbied also by civil society and the public. And then we start lobbying the minister. Simultaneously, the public can also lobby the minister. I remember sitting in the minister's office explaining all these things. And then he said, okay, I hear you. And then he didn't say anything. Then one day, just in the parliament grounds, he saw me, he said to me, it is time. I said, it is time for what? He says, I'm repealing Section 79. From that time until the first reading, we had 3 or 4 workshops because all the civil society organizations involved in sexual reproductive health put in their money in training, CBOs, training through the whole country. We printed a pamphlet. The pamphlet went all over the country.
There were pamphlets that were created in collaboration with Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights and HIV Justice Worldwide, with SAL, CARASA, and they were aiming at all the different issues that were involved with criminalization. So they were packaged differently depending on who they were aimed at. So there were pamphlets for the legislators. There were pamphlets targeting the medical profession. They also mentioned the science around HIV criminalization. They mentioned the expert consensus statement, and that was important to indicate, where experts' opinions were. They also mentioned the comparative analysis, like the regional consensus around HIV/CRIM, looking at laws that had been passed to decriminalize in other countries, looking at criminal cases that had come before the courts and where the courts had actually referred to the science around HIV and the problems with HIV/CRIM.
But I must give it on to people, network of people living with HIV, because they made the change by standing up in public hearings and saying, I'm HIV positive. I have a potential of being arrested because you people know I'm HIV positive. I'm a potential of being accused by this law. So that touched people.
When the opportunity arose to have some conversations around willful transmission and repealing that section, a lot of stakeholders actually invited ZNMP Plus to be part of that, because there was no way they could have done that without the coordinator of people living with HIV in Zimbabwe. What we did was to empower the expect clients, some of those people who had experience in living with HIV. And the most encouraging thing about that was we also had discordant couples who were willing to give evidence. The wife is HIV positive, the husband is HIV negative, and they will come together and give their evidence to the parliament. And so those are the things that helped a lot in terms of empowering the constituents and convincing the policymakers. The community was able to articulate that. We also had community engagement meetings with the general community. What we did was to sensitize and also raise awareness among community members that being HIV positive is not a death sentence. People living with HIV can actually live full lives, just like anyone who is HIV negative, as long as they are on treatment. That helped a lot, and it brought confidence among the constituents of people living with HIV in Zimbabwe.
The repeal of Section 79 was done in a sort of indirect way through a new marriage law that was being promulgated. And in effect, it was a separate section that had nothing to do with everything else. And it was just a few words, just to say Section 79 being hereby repealed. It could have been perhaps to avoid the public backlash, so that only the people who had been involved in the advocacy actually noticed.
I loved the public hearings, I must say, because people were singing outside. There were those singing, condemning the marriage bill. There were those who were condemning, some of us saying, we have these doctors who want to allow people to spread HIV anyhow. They were singing. And you know, it was beautiful though, outside.
After we had done all this work, I actually also then went again after the law was repealed. We did further media campaigns and sensitizations to further amplify to the community and to encourage people to go out there and get tested, to get on treatment and to share their statuses with partners. And along the way, somehow, we were surprised to learn in March 2024, I believe, that there was an attempt to reintroduce criminal penalties for HIV transmission.
There's a double-edged sword in that because of the indirect way that it was repealed, it's possible that a lot of people that are important in terms of lawmaking did not quite understand the rationale for the repeal of the law. And that is probably why, barely 2 years later, there was a sort of reintroduction of HIV criminalization.
Some people called me and said, are you aware that the law you repealed is coming back into power? Then I phoned the Minister of Justice and I made an appointment. And then he said, Ruth, somebody has been naughty and he added HIV to Section 78, where it was never, which means the person wasn't happy with what we did and they were hoping that nobody would notice and then to be made law.
In response, the HLPC team took actions such as further media campaigns and community forums where we were trying to speak in the community to say, hey, what's happening? We even did a joint statement with the HIV Justice Network where we were outlining why the good that was done by repealing Section 79 should not be undone by introducing an amendment.
The minister, who is the same minister who had actually championed the repeal of Section 79, then indicated that that wasn't the intention of government to recriminalize, and that it was probably an error that happened with drafting. And so at the end of the day, that provision that added HIV to Section 78 was taken out.
So there are still around 30 countries on the African continent that have HIV-specific criminal laws. What messages would you like parliamentarians in those countries to hear so that they too can end HIV criminalization?
No, the message I'll send to them is that some of us did advocate for criminalization because there was no solution. It was just a dire straits situation. And now we have control programs, HIV control programs that work. Get yourself tested, get yourself on treatment. Things are different. There's so much available for you to survive. There is no need for you to criminalize somebody.
Law reform or policy advocacy is not an issue that we can keep quiet about. We have to continuously advocate, because for Africa, and with the opposition that is in place right now, every day there are different laws that continue to crop up that criminalize people living with HIV. So being able to identify these laws, even when they are still at the bill level, before they become laws, is very important.
One also very huge lesson is that you cannot take your eyes off the ball. Having had the victory, you always have to be cognizant of the fact that that victory can be short-lived.
I also learned to appreciate the importance of evidence. If you seek to bring change, especially from a legal perspective, it has to have a logical explanation. We were able to quote studies that had been done by institutions like HIV Justice Network to show that the law, ever since it was created, it had not been effective. And primarily the people who were targeted were women. There was also global momentum. Zimbabwe's advocacy efforts occurred alongside a growing global movement to decriminalize HIV transmission.
Global solidarity is very, very key in how we do our advocacy. So we call upon the partners that still support advocacy work, like the work of challenging HIV criminalization and criminalization of any nature, that more investment is needed.
Nothing is impossible. Zimbabwe was able to decriminalize HIV, and this is a country that was known for actually going ahead with prosecutions. And if this could happen in such a country, it actually shows that advocacy actually works.